Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and wherever you are in the world, welcome to the first 2023 webinar for the Review of Political Economy. It promises to be a great webinar, great speaker, great book, and we have quite a few people in attendance, so I'm sure it's going to be a very good event. Before we begin, I do want to just say that I'm dedicating that we are all dedicating this webinar today to the memory of Luigi Pazinetti, who died earlier this week. And a great economist. I've got, several of his books, as we all do. And it is really one of the last Cambridge economists to have passed, Jeff Harcourt recently as well. So before we begin the webinar, I'm just going to ask Maria Cristina to say a few words about Luigi Pazinetti.
And hello to everybody. It is indeed very sad that we have to remember Luigi in this way, but I think he would have been very happy to be part of this conversation. He was passionate about Cambridge. He was also sometimes very bitter about the way things went, but never lost faith that somewhere, sometimes, the roots of that kind of economics would go back to life somewhere around the world. I just want to say that he was working to the very end. As a matter of fact, it was a bit excruciating because the book to which he was dedicating his last energies, he was just drafting and drafting again. He was never happy that this was satisfying him, but in the end, I hope that this last book will come out the way in which he left it. And the other thing I want to say about Luigi is that we did a collection of essays in memory, to celebrate his 90th birthday. And he was very, very pleased with that. And the book will be presented in a couple of weeks' time somewhere in Italy. And I think this is, of course, just the beginning of a set of events that I'm sure will be planned around the world to celebrate him. I just want to add a personal note. I met him many, many years ago. We did a lot of things together. And one thing I would like to say that he was always very, very careful to protect the Cambridge tradition. And even in the case of the relationship between Khan and Sraffa, I remember me and him walking up and down Richard Khan in the Fellows Gardens in Cambridge to persuade him not to publish a review of Sraffa's book, because Luigi was fearful that since the review was done when Richard was not completely in his prime, might have damage, not as much Sraffa, but Richard as a reviewer. So this sense of being protected of the Cambridge tradition is a trait that I remember very, very dearly. That's it. I think that is not very much, but this is what I can say at the spur of the moment.
No, that's wonderful. And I wanted to say that he has two entries in the Encyclopedia of Post-Keynesian Economics, but he also he insisted on seeing the entries that dealt with his work or Cambridge economics. So he took the time to review many of those entries for me. And I didn't dawn on me why. Well, I figured he was interested in it, but when you speak about him being protective of, I can assume that that was the reason.
Yeah, exactly.
The Review of Political Economy will be doing a symposium sometime next year with the guest editor, Nadia Gabellini. So more information on that will follow. Okay. We are now prepared to begin the webinar. So it's a webinar dedicated to Ashwani Saith's new book, Cambridge Economics in the Post-Keynesian Era. Ashwani Saith is Professor Emeritus at the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague. and formerly was chair of development studies and head of the Development Studies Institute at the LSE. He studied economics at St. Stephen's College in Delhi and taught at the Delhi School of Economics. In the 70s, he took his PhD in economics while at Trinity College, Cambridge, and served on the staff of Faculty of Economics before becoming a research fellow at Queen Elizabeth House in Oxford. He's been on the editorial board of several leading development journals, including Development and Change, and has published extensively on a wide range of development themes. His work related to Cambridge economics includes a book on Ajit Singh, and a book on, or rather an article on Joan Robinson and Indian planning. He has a current paper called Cambridge Journal of Economics, a Form of One's Own, in the Review of Political Economy in the current January issue. And he's currently working on a project of mine on the historical and institutional roots of post-Keynesian economics in India, which will be forthcoming in Rope in a few years now. Well, without further ado, please, Ashwani, if you want, you can begin. I believe you are muted.
There you go.
There you go.
That's okay. It's an honor, and I have you to thank, and also the four commentators and all the people who are joining in. I think it's to me the real value addition of this is listening to the four commentators, and then the reflections which are coming from this vast array of specialists. And I would value that. So I'm hopeless at keeping time, but I'm going to do my best to keep it as short as possible, opposite to the book, and hopefully have more time to listen to all of you about this. Well, first of all, an apology. I've made that earlier before the start, and I make it to everybody about the length of the book. I somehow blame it on the virus, on COVID, 2-3 years of the pandemic, just sitting from 4 o'clock in the morning, and you go into a zone, you forget time, the story takes over, gets into your head. Until it's done, it's not done, and the length doesn't matter, and time does not matter. You just write the story, and that's the way it happened. I warned the publishers, look, it's getting too long. And now with the new technologies and marketing models and business models of selling, they didn't care. So it went on. It went to lots of reviewers. I have to say also to legal readers for reasons that you can imagine. And it was passed by them, and they thought it's all right. It's not problematic. And some of the reviews said, well, you know, there's a chapter and there's a chapter on that, but there's no chapter on economic history. So I said, oh God, you know, there you go, and then a chapter on economic history. But in this story on sort of, you know, displacement in Cambridge, the core of the story is in economics, is actually about the Department of Applied Economics, the DAE, and in relation to the faculty. I think that's the heart of the story, in a way, to my mind. That's the driver. But once that particular battle plays out, then there are implications downstream, and the battle is then carried through, or the implications of that are carried through to other subjects. Sociology gets evicted, development gets evicted in due course in different ways. Economic history, as I said, in that becomes history, the Faculty of Economics, more or less. It was very powerful earlier. And so on. So each of these is a kind of a story and a narrative on its own. Now, I could have just limited it to the DAE story alone, but it became impossible. There were too many, the same forces which were trying to monopolize the economic discipline in Cambridge also didn't believe in multidisciplinarity, let alone, you know, different views in economics. And so they thought of these things as being extraneous, not relevant. And so I thought that those are part of the main story. If you just stand back, all those other things come into play. And that accounts partly for the length. But it does also mean that not everybody needs to read everything in this way. So I want to say how the book might, how you could look at it. You can look at it as, of course, a case study in paradigm change. It's not intended to be an example of that per se, but if people are interested in that, yes. To my mind, it's also a kind of a repository in some ways, because there is something there on seminars, there is something there on textbooks, and there's things like this, and there's something there on journals, on the RE. So there are things that you can go to which are a record of how things were happening in Cambridge, say over the last 100 years nearly. And so that's not necessarily part of this particular story, but this story, I think, is enriched and is given us boundaries by going back and seeing what it is that was being fought about and was being lost. So that's the part of the reason for the thing to be so large. I think when Gunnar Myrdal he did Asian drama, and I remember a conversation between colleagues at the faculty, and they said, "How much of it have you read?" And the answer was about half a kilo. So I think in my case, it's 2.2 kilos, I'm told, the book. So if you take any half kilo, you'll be all right. It's not meant to be read cover to cover. I've not read it cover to cover myself. It's as I said, it's kind of it's a repository. It's a resource of sorts. But there's a core in the story, which is a chronological story of a campaign, which needs to be read as such. And for those who don't have the time, well, the abstracts can help, and then you can go to whichever parts appeal to you, and the story will connect. To me, it's an untold story. In what way? There's Francis here. I can see the name of Jane here. So many others. It's untold in a particular sense. I think so many people participated in it, and they came in and some went out. Whoever came in had a window, and the window might have been 15 degrees, 30 degrees, their department, their particular project, their groups. And of course, they had knowledge of what was happening around them, but their depth of knowledge was about the field of focus was a particular line. And I discovered in the process, when I was looking up this archival material and talking to everybody to bring the story together, it was striking how new things came up. So when I talked to somebody else, they said, "Oh, I didn't know that." And so there's a kind of a collection here. There's a kind of a collective memory of being constructed. And of course, there are problems about that. I'm aware of this, but that's the kind of a framework that I see. I'm just a scribe and trying to make sense and bring them together in a way. This leads, I think, also to, I've made one of the comments about this, that is, speaking to many of these colleagues or friends, some of them found the memories painful, and they would rather have forgotten them and not gone into them. And that's the way it was. And I have to acknowledge that. And so I think that's very important. It's also I'd make no pretense that this is a BBC balanced news. It isn't. It's a story from one side of the battle lines, and one's own sort of convictions or beliefs or orientations are very clear, and I make no bones about that. At the same time, I've tried within that, I've tried to be as balanced and fair as possible, without deviating and starting to cover up things or to tell untruths. This is not the case. So that's where the tricky part was, and that's been settled. So I do think that it's in this way of telling the story. It's my story way of telling it, and even people who've actually interviewed and with me and so on, they might not entirely agree with everything else that I'm saying. I agree with that. And so I've said in the preface there that it's a bit like Akira Kurosawa, Rochon, or Lawrence Darrell, the Alexandria Quartet, where the story is what you see, and there could be multiple stories because there are multiple windows looking into that story. And I think whoever wants to write another story, please do. And so that's, to my mind, that would be fascinating. So but this is my story. And I think if people say, oh, there was something else to it. Yes, incremental, very nice. If you disagree with something, that's great too. But that's what I want to say about the story. Please don't try and read it as a book. It's not meant to be that, but the core story of the DAE is a running battle. Now, for people who don't know the Cambridge story, I think it wouldn't make sense if I don't say something there. It's all going to be very brief and shorthand in that manner. There's a faculty of economics. And at some point in the faculty of economics, around post-war, decided before the war, but started immediately post-war, we have the Department of Applied Economics. And people in the Department of Applied Economics, the economists there, are actually, this is one formation, but there are two different autonomous groups, the faculty and the Department of Applied Economics. So doing projects, we're doing research in a different way. That's Stone, Ben Godley, Brown Redaway, Francis is here, and so on and so forth. But on the faculty side, it's a traditional faculty. Now, there's a faculty board, which is crucial, which makes decisions on everything, appointments, the works, and so on and so forth. And in this period of battles, faculty wars, control over the faculty board was critical. That's really was the heart of the matter. If you control the faculty board, you could make decisions one way, or you could push them a little bit in the other way, and that mattered over time. Now, in the faculty board, people from the Department of Applied Economics could vote in the elections, also people from the faculty. So when the battles started, and the mainstream economists, that group, their interest was in somehow deal with the Department of Applied Economics in a manner that they would not be able to vote in the faculty board elections. If they could somehow be eased out of that, then because the Department of Applied Economics were younger, more applied-oriented economists, more left-wing oriented economists, and so on. So although they were not all left-wing, but on the whole, the leaning was very much more in that direction. And they would be voting more or less, working as a bloc. So this is where the real battle lines in a way were drawn. How to do this? Well, the mainstreamers didn't much like macroeconomics. They didn't much like of the kind that is being done. They didn't like applied economics. Frank Hahn had a very poor view of policy-oriented work. He thought that was not really serious economics. And so the idea was to somehow, if you could ease that out, that would be good. So that's where the fight was. And the first, when the balance shifts, I mean, people ask if, I can go into that more, but there isn't that much time. The first of the things to fall in this is the Economic Journal. But as I've explained in that article on the Cambridge Journal of Economics, but when the Economic Journal went away, at that time, people were still very upbeat, thinking about, things were going well in Cambridge and so on. But that's when when the Cambridge Journal of Economics came about. But then after that, the first major blow was the Cambridge Economic Policy Group, which was Ben Godley and Francis Cripps. And that was a very systematic challenge and an onslaught on the group. And it was fought not just inside, but outside. And that was because you had, the way to do it was to cut their funding. And their funding got cut because they had a grant from the SSRC. And that was through a story which is there in that chapter. Please have a look. And that was eased out, so the place was closed down. So that was one, and whole team had to scatter and move off midstream, mid-work. And I think one of the things which also was very much at play was that this group was challenging the economic policies of the times in a very public and a very systematic and very analytical way. They'd come up with a publication, which was the modeling, which was based on Francis's work. And they were modeling policy and seeing what all was going wrong, and that proved politically a hot potato. And I think there were knives drawn for this thing. I should mention here, this is also the time when this new Cambridge debate was also taking place. New Cambridge, the Cambridge Keynesianism, and this equation and this model and so on, in which Kahn and Posner and co were very upset on one side, and there was Nicky Caldor and Robert Neal, Francis himself on the other. So this biff-baff was taking place along on the sides in this. The one next to fall was the Cambridge Growth Project of Richard Stone. Richard Stone was still there in 80. He retired in 80. And this project, again, had the same way of being done in, which was the funding was slowly cut off, a bit more slowly in 2 stages, but that also went. So when all these people went, there were something like 15 or 20 positions of people that had to move away. So Cambridge was in a way denuded of these applied economics. Some people stayed, but most of them had to scatter. Alongside this, there was a departmental review instituted at the university level. Again, a lot of politics in that. And that departmental review carried on for 4 years. I've called it a 4-year imposition. And while all this was happening, people's futures were at stake. They didn't know what was happening, schooling, housing, whatever. A lot of people left, but they could see that this was a fight which was being lost to the mainstream. And so in due course, this led to when Godley left, his term was over after 15 years, and a new director took over. And the new director was a microeconomist on the whole, and not much worried about the macroeconomic side of things, which in any case had been denuded by this time. And I think you have a big shift in the whole Department of Applied Economics in there. There are many more sides to the story, which are there in the book. Please have a look. And of course, this leads now also to the expulsion of sociology, to development, and to economic history, and so on. So I think at the end of the day, you're left with the kind of faculty which is what shall I say, a cousin of North American traditional mainstream, trying to be that. That's kind of a thing it is. If you like that, that's great. Otherwise, it's different. Now, how was this done? And what led to this downfall? Why is it that, and I think there are many stories here about how this whole collapse took place. The one thing which I don't do in the book at all, it's not about this, is to evaluate alternative theories and theoretical positions. That's not what the book is about. As I said, I'm arguing from one side of the line. You take certain kind of a thing as read. On that basis, you could say that, I mean, I don't admit the idea that, Keynesianism and post-Keynesianism and the kind of radical development which was going on, or the economic history thing that was going on, was flawed theoretically or in any serious way, and therefore it had to be moved out. I think that's, to my mind, an untenable position, and I don't go into that at all in that way. So it was to do with politics, and so usually when you hear these stories from amongst Cambridge economists and others, it's really about what happened in Cambridge. People who were fighting with each other, they didn't get on, and so on. And so eventually it's led to the whole house, it collapsed. I think there's a lot to be said for these internal stories, for the internal explanations. But I think that's not enough. And I think there is an entirely different side. It's like an open economy. It's Cambridge in the world. And it might have been at that time the pinnacle of something of heterodoxy. But the forces which were outside were very powerful. They were the gates. And they're the ones who actually gave power to the people who are inside those gates in Cambridge to actually do those fights and battles. But the internal stories are quite a few. I'm not going to go into them. Student preferences changed. I don't think that's really, strictly speaking, true. Cambridge was always marketable. Insularity is a big one. Cambridge is very insular. Yes, always was. Not a reason for why change happened at that point in time. Squabbling. Jeff Harcourt called them, all these professors, bantam cocks on a dung heap, he called them. Typical Jeff. This is very true, fighting like mad all the time, one way or the other, but they had a common enemy. So it was, this is where they got together. When there was something to do with neoclassicism or mainstream economics, then they would come together in different ways. Not easy to bring them together, but they would come together on the whole. Then the idea is that, well, indifference, mindlessness of the seniors, they didn't pay attention to the reproduction of the faculty. I think there is truth in that. But it's a thing which I explore a little bit in the book, but there'll be many more here who will know about this. But forward thinking and planning, the way that, for example, Frank Hahn put his academy of students, or as he was called, uncle and nephews, into different universities and gave them positions of power and so on. That project was not really there as far as the Cambridge people were concerned, the seniors were concerned. So I think there's culpability there. And curiously, if the story hinges a lot around Frank Khan, and it does, because it's a very powerful figure in many ways, more ways than one, it's interesting to see that, I call it a Trojan horse, but that Trojan horse is pulled into Cambridge by three rather unlikely people: Brian Redaway, Nicky Kaldor, Richard Kahn. These are three people in different ways who have a hand and a key role in Frank's appointment and coming back into Cambridge in 1972 as a professor, 62 earlier as well. So there's culpability in some form, or generosity, you can say, open view. They were confident, they didn't think this would lead to anything nasty. Then there's a question of demography, which has generally been overlooked. I think if you look at the age clustering, there are a lot of retirements of the senior people and some deaths all clustered. And so you suddenly have a lot of appointments to be made, a lot of gaps in the faculty. And in 1979, after Thatcher came in, she started a policy of early retirement. This was a part of her attack on the universities. And 4 or 5 persons also took early retirement, professors took early retirement or retired at that point in time. And that meant that, for example, Robert Neal retired early, 4 years ago. And because he retired earlier, the position opened up. And that's a position which, for example, Partha Dasgupta came into in 1985. So many of these positions were, I think they came up at this point. And so if you see the balance of the professoriate at that time, all the heterodox and all the seniors are virtually gone. Wynne is there, but Wynne was actually pretty wounded by the closure of the CEPG at that point in time. Bert Turner was there, but he was about to leave himself. And there's hardly anybody around who could fight the heterodox fight in the faculty board. So this is a point of inflection. And so in 1985, you have the appointment of Partha Dasgupta. 1987-88, the DAE directorship goes to Professor David Newbury. And I think they would be identified and recognized as part of a mainstream group at that point in time. And of course, before that, Robin Matthews had got the professorship in 1980. I think now these also times you're talking about Luigi Pasinetti, but these are now people, Pasinetti, Harcourt, Richard Goodwin, if you want, Francis himself, others who were there, but had the clear possibility of stepping into the applied economics or into the theoretical economics areas and leading Cambridge on. But that's exactly where the faculty board and those sorts of political maneuverings actually matter. So I think there's a lot of that which was at stake. So I think that this story is, and this widens out into the control of the commanding heights outside. They control the SSRC funding through their whole range of juniors and other colleagues. There is the control over the Royal Economic Society, of which Frank Khan at this time was the president. Through that, you control the Association of the University Teachers of Economics, which actually goes across all departments. And so you can influence how things happen. Through that, you control the panels of the research assessment exercise, which is research, which means that you decide what is good research, what happens. And so you have a centralized control through which you can actually implement this whole project of taking out apostasy. And so we come to 1662, that sort of a thing where you have a one truth, one religion to be followed in this way, that way. So this is a story which you're all familiar with in other places, but that's the way it happens there as well. So that's, I think, roughly speaking, that's the broad story of the campaign. And the campaign is a sequence of things. And there's one other factor, that people who stayed back in Cambridge, loyalists or deep heterodox people, radical people, Marxists, otherwise, they're the ones who didn't have a job to aspire to. There were no chairs around. I mean, there was a chair, structural chair, but there wasn't personal chairs were very rare to get. And if the other faculty controlled it, other side, there's no way you could do anything. So if you stayed back, you suffered. And you had to wait, you had to be patient, and you had to be happy with that life. But later on, even that life was not possible. On the other side, if you see the heterodox, the mainstream side, you find that Franklin was really excellent at this. This is recognized by the David Newbury's excellent appreciation of Franklin he's done, in which he said that he was so committed. Parker also emphasizes this. He was so committed to his students and to his student academy and to the loyalists, if you see what I mean, and his nephews. And the nephew uncle thing comes from the LSE. Apparently, when you were a young staff member of the LSE, you were assigned a mentor, and the mentor was called uncle. So you were uncles and nephews. And that's the time of Gorman and of Alan Walters and of Frank Hahn, who were there at the same time, and they controlled that faculty. And from there, Frank Hahn had come into Cambridge. So his uncle tradition, uncle came through. And it is this cohort of the younger people. If you look at them, I have a table there where something like 10 or 15 of them become professors at the age of 25, 26, 28 in all kinds of universities around in the UK. Now, if you're head of a department and professor at 28 or 30, you're going to be there for another 20 or 30 years. So if you're looking at these placements, they are very powerful in terms of influencing the direction of the subject. And on top of that, if you have the panels for research assessment and you have the Royal Economic Society, you have a whole map on top of it in which you are located. There's a section there which if you're interested in following careers, you could look at something called the glittering prizes, where there's a contrast between the careers which were there of the heterodox people, squeezed out more or less, and the glittering careers of the people in the mainstream who go from success to one prize to another. I'm not questioning their competence as economists. I'm just pointing out the differences in career patterns which were possible because of these divisions. Okay, so I can't go on with all this, but it led eventually to what Brian Supple, economics historian, and not necessarily on this side of the line, he called it wanton intellectual vandalism. When sociology was being eased out, he said it's wanton intellectual vandalism to do this. This was in the context of the attacks on sociology, in the context of the Rothschild inquiry. And I think that's what happened in Cambridge. And so we've had a huge loss. Now, where does that leave us? And I think what's happened is that all the disciplines and the groups which were evicted have subsequently shown themselves to be extremely dynamic, successful, powerful. They proved they didn't have to prove their credentials, but they actually are flourished. But they flourished elsewhere. They've flourished elsewhere, either elsewhere in Cambridge itself or outside of Cambridge altogether. And outside of Cambridge, the seed of heterodoxy, in any case, we say Cambridge, but there's Italy in Cambridge, and there's Canada in Cambridge, and there's a whole range of countries in Cambridge which make Cambridge of the old time. And that's where the subject is again flourishing. And if you see now, I think that there's a kind of a renaissance, what Luigi Passetti was saying, the unfinished revolution in a way, and that's actually moving on at a pretty brisk pace. And the mainstream, especially in the context of the new challenges in the world economy and the world that you see now, if you compare it from that time to now, you find that it's absolutely more or less incapable of addressing those sort of questions in any regard whatsoever. So this period is of the 1920 to 1980 kind of a period, somewhere there, 25 to 85 period. And you can think of those 60-year period as some kind of an interregnum between a powerful neoclassical period before that and another one after that. But in both the periods before that, if you think of the period before 1920, the world economy, every economy was showing inequality, depressions, inability to control the economy, you found, leading to, the end of laissez-faire, etc., that sort of thing. But the theory was going the other way, ignoring it. If you see it now, it's even more. That contrast, the scissors, is even greater. You find scissors which are absolutely phenomenal. The problems are not just about unemployment and some aspects of, there are huge problems at every level. And climate change is coming as well. On top of that, the dysfunctionality of labor altogether has come into play. So here we have, but the theory carries on. And I wonder that if the Keynesian revolution and the switch in policy paradigms in, say, in the UK, where Keynesianism took over, and even the US for a while, could happen on the basis of 20, 30 years of a theoretical breakthroughs, even less than that. But look at the kind of crises we have today. And the mainstream theory is, if I may say so, is rotten to the core in terms of its ability to deal with these crises. And yet you find that it is still strongly ensconced and is not really being dislodged, although heterodoxy and the heterodox traditions are so, as I said, a period of renaissance, and they've become so powerful and so vocal and researching, wonderful research going on, and yet it is not really fully able to get purchase on that central core of policy, that mechanism. And I think that the reason for that is the extreme inequality, which has been encouraged or been brought about in that old model, and about the power of the state. The state is no longer that a state of 10 days that shook the world or something of that kind. We have a state which is supremely in control of coercive and surveillance powers over its citizens and control. And it's a slide from democracy in some way or the other into some forms of plutocracy. And I think in that scenario, that's a scenario confronting with all these problems, the heterodox traditions at this point in time, and how to cope and address these issues. And but I must say, looking around and reading all the work and seeing this, I am a follower, I'm a consumer in this area. It's very powerful, and I think the problem lies in politics, and not in the power of the ideas which are being analyzed and discussed by the group which is forms as part of this webinar. So anyhow, there it is. Louis-Philippe, don't read the book cover to cover. It's not meant for that. Over to you.
Thank you, Ashwani. I forgot to unmute myself. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I will go to the first speaker, the first commentator, and I'll just go in alphabetical order, if that's okay. And the first speaker is Francis Cripps, who you've, Ashwani, mentioned quite a few times. He's currently president of Alphametrics. He studied mathematics and economics at Cambridge in the 60s and worked with Nicholas Kaldor as an advisor to the Treasury before joining the Cambridge Economic Policy Group in the Department of Applied Economics in the 70s, where he built applied macro models. He later developed a front office treasury system for Japanese banks in the 90s, moved to Thailand, where he built a planning system for the Budget Bureau and risk management system for the Ministry of Finance. In the last 15 years, he has supported a global data bank policy model for UNDESA, the ILO, and UNCTAD, while continuing applied research on local and international policy issues with partners in Thailand and Europe. Francis, if you can keep your comments to about 10 minutes, that would be great.
Thank you, Ashwani, for writing this epic, which I never imagined. It's a story I never imagined could be told because it's very extensive. And as Ashwani said, I don't think any of us knew more than one part of the whole, of what was going on. Maybe one or two people could foresee where it led. But I think on the whole, people in Cambridge and elsewhere didn't anticipate the sequence of things which happened. I have to say that Ashwani's book, nothing in his book clashes with my own memories of people and events and issues in the time that I was at Cambridge from the 1960s to the 1980s. But happily, I left Cambridge before the later part of his story unfolded, and I have been living far away through the period when the Department of Applied Economics was eventually closed down and the discipline of mainstream economics was enforced much more widely across the UK, as he described in chapter 13 of his book, which I think is, to me, was a little bit of a rather chilling read. But I occasionally meet people from other disciplines from Cambridge who tell me that something not entirely dissimilar may have happened in other faculties as well as in the Department of Economics. And I think it's part of a tide of control of university teaching and research, which is very widespread. And things are not the same as they were when I was a student or when I was a researcher in the 60s and 70s. If you don't mind, I just tell one or two personal memories, and then I'll come to a few reflections to follow on what Ashwani has just said. I did, in fact, graduate in 1965 after studying economics with Jim Mirrlees and Frank Hahn, as well as the Keynesians. And my conclusion when I graduated was that economic theory, whether macro or micro, was too general and abstract to be of any practical use. But I then spent 2 years here in the Far East. And after those 2 years, it became obvious to me that there is a very important challenge how to analyze the structure and growth development of developing economy. And this made me accept an invitation from Frank Hahn to go back to Cambridge and teach mathematical economics. But I was a bad, I think Frank may have made a mistake in regarding me as an apostle, because when I returned, I immediately took up with Caldo. And the reason was, fundamental reason was that his interest and that of the very large research group in the Department of Applied Economics was in developing empirical analysis of policy issues in an attempt to understand things that are going on in the real world. And we were not interested in economics as a branch of mathematics, although we were not against use of mathematical formulae and formalization or reference to data, statistical data. On the contrary, we hope to learn both from institutional evidence and from statistical data. And I think the commitment to policy in the real world was the hallmark of the Keynesian and post-Keynesian tradition, almost irrespective of the beliefs of individuals. I mean, it's possible to quarrel about the explanation of things in a good way when we're not sure that we have found the truth. And we hope to learn. This was the key point, and this attracted people from all over the world, so that it was quite a cosmopolitan atmosphere. We pursued the whole project of learning from data and institutional study in the 1970s. But in the end of the day, our analyses failed largely because they were kind of taken down by the much more abstract theorizing, general theorizing, which was welcome in political circles. I mean, in most political circles. I don't want to say it was only the right. I think applied research was too slow and demanding to be very helpful for the frontline policy community, whether it was members of political parties or the UK Treasury or central banks or for that matter, even the European Commission. They all wanted results and not research, or they wanted research that would come up with predictable results. The failure of empirical research to nail down the irrelevance of a very large part of popular economic theory is a very important issue. It's due in part to the inadequacy of available data, although the data available today is far better than it was in the 1960s and 70s. And it's due, I think, in large part to the methodology in use of econometric techniques to align algebraic models, which are ex ante models with statistical data, and draw a veil over the imperfection of the data itself, and also largely obscure the dynamics of institutional behavior, which closely related to the data. So if you have an algebraic model and then you can download the statistical data and use an econometric program to run large numbers of estimations and then write up a paper, but it doesn't get us anywhere. I think this failure of econometrics and failure of a methodology, not of the individual models, is quite well known among many econometricians, but maybe is underestimated by theorists and people with interest in policy. And I would like to suggest to Ashwani to look at an article by Aris Panos in the Palgrave Handbook on Econometrics, published in 2006, which is very forthcoming on the reasons for the failure of econometrics. What he says, the failure to furnish apposite empirical foundations to economics. But I don't think this has improved much, and one could speculate why. Maybe it's because econometrics and theoretical econometrics is a rather esoteric discipline that most people shy away from. It needs to be engaged. It's a very serious problem. So just to conclude, as a member of the Cambridge community in its heyday, I learned a lot that was very useful to myself and to others throughout the rest of my life. But I agree with Ashwani that little progress has been made in the ensuing period from the 80s through to the present day in understanding macroeconomic aspects of the global economy in any depth. And we have an additional problem that international policies are hostage to the attitudes of nationalist governments that lack the policy space, they lack the understanding, and they lack the policy analysis and instruments to protect their own electorates in a more constructive way. So this leads to continuous treatment of policy issues as an area of contestation and dispute. It's very evident looking at the West from the East, where I live, because people have such different ideas and different concerns, and they can't put the whole thing together. We can only hope that there will be some new basis for independent research institutes and intradisciplinary as well as interdisciplinary and international exchanges between younger researchers in all countries of the world, not confined to the rich countries which have generous philanthropists and leading universities. Otherwise, it's hard to see how the imbalance in understanding could be rectified. And we also have to hope that a lot more investment will be undertaken to improve data, particularly on sources of income and wealth, on financial balance sheets, which are sadly lacking for most countries, on the movement of people in any detail, and for that matter, on issues like urbanization and land use, which are not generally well covered by international and global data banks. Finally, I come back to the issue of econometrics. By itself, econometrics can never uncover the institutional behaviors that condition the world that we live in. But we need to look at the data, nevertheless, in order to size up and calibrate the relative importance of the different dynamics which are interacting nowadays over a wide canvas, not limited to finance and national accounts. Okay, I hope I haven't gone much over the time. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Francis. Thank you very much for those comments. I'm going to turn to Joseph Halevi for his
Can you hear me?
comments.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, one moment, Joseph. Are you going to turn your camera on?
Just a second. I may not have.
While you figure that out, I'm just going to read your
Okay.
quick bio. Joseph Halevi is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Political Economy at the University of Sydney and a member of the faculty of the International University College of Turin in Italy. Thank you for joining us this morning. Joseph, there you go. I see you.
Okay.
So you have about, good morning, and you have about 10 minutes or so.
Okay, I think I will speak less. I am actually reading Professor Saith's book from cover to cover because I have to review it for the Jeff Harcourt Peter Kleiser journal. That's how I call it, the Economics and Labor Relation review. And therefore I'm compelled to read it from cover to cover. And I found it extremely interesting. And I think he also went into an incredible amount of research into the community, especially about the discussion regarding the new Cambridge economics and how it was received or not received at the level of the Labour government concerning the issue of fiscal policies, and that made very, very interesting reading. So on this, I have not finished the book completely. I still have about 400 pages, but it is true that can be read by taking, I read one chapter in the second volume and then one chapter in the first volume. You can do that. I mean, it's true that you don't have to read it from chapter to chapter, but I think the first volume connects quite well. I have some misgivings, perhaps, in relation to the last chapter, which is also the theme on which Professor Saith has ended his introduction, namely the optimism, the green shoots, as he defines them. My personal observation and experience to some extent, but mostly observations, is that the space for heterodox, I call it heterodox, I don't necessarily like this term, heterodox economics, political economy coming from the classics, going through and with Marx and the whole thing, baggage that we know, and Kaletsky and all these people. And the space for that is actually narrowing. it's extremely difficult to find courses on this, let alone departments that have a significant representation of this kind of orientations. And uh, this situation, one of the most significant failures, which is not to their fault, to the members' fault, has been the closing of the department of what happened at the University of Notre Dame. That was one of the largest heterodox departments in the United States, if not perhaps the largest with Amherst. And well, have been demoted. They've been first, been taken away from the graduate school, and then they were put. So they taught only undergraduate, and secondly, they were put into the political science faculty. So in Australia, there's virtually no. There are individuals here and there, but there is no systemic. Okay, it's a small country, but there is no systemic department can be identified. There is a sort of political economy department at the University of Sydney, but this is mostly activism, sociological in a bad way, my view, and it eschews, they avoid theory and that sort of stuff, and they avoid statistics as well, by the way, unless there are statistics about inequalities and poverty and stuff like that, and they all love Piketty. That's the thing. And Piketty is a good man, but only because his parents are good. His parents were left wingers, and he grew up in a left wing environment. But if you look at his book on Capital, when he talks about theory, it's a disaster. It's a complete disaster. So in Italy also, I mean, that there are people today, students in universities, that you talk to them about, except perhaps Catholic University as the other, about, say, people like Silos Labini, people like Graziani. These they were giants. They were world giants. These people are being forgotten. Napoleon, they're being totally forgotten, and there is no mechanism of reproduction. So I have a very, very bleak view about that, and I think that if green shoots are to come, they will have to be in different places. They have to be in places which are the new centers, in the plural, of gravity. They cannot be the so-called advanced, which are no longer that advanced capitalist countries in terms of dynamics. I mean, they're not, but they should come up in places like India and possibly places like China. Then it's more difficult because the Chinese universities and authorities are very happy with standardized textbooks. They are very happy with that. And then they make the political decisions according to the political party and so forth. But they're very happy. So I have a very bleak view about the green shoots. This is my point. The second, my main observation. A second observation is just a question, really. I also appreciated very much the chapter on development and the role played by what Professor Saith calls alphabet alphabet Rao. And Alphabet Rao's book was one of my first books that I read in Italy. It was translated by Feltrinelli in Italy in the mid 60s, I think, the mid 60s. And I actually got that reference from the Communist Party. But anyway, I wonder whether, in relation to development, there have been actually an influence mostly from India onto Cambridge rather than the other way. Because when I think about people like, say, for instance, Ashok Rudra, K.N. Raj, and the people who came in the wake of the Mahalanobis, type of theorizing about planning and so forth. And another person like Naqvi, I wonder whether the influence was mostly from India onto Cambridge, although these people might have studied in England for a while. So this is a question that came to my mind while reading the development chapter. Okay, I'll finish here. Finished.
Thank you, Joseph. We'll go to Marc Lavoie, our next commentator. Marc is a professor emeritus at the University of Ottawa, as well as a professor emeritus at the University of Sorbonne Paris Nord in France. He is the author of Post-Keynesian Economics New Foundations at Elgar, now in its second edition, and a collection of his essays have been published by Edward Elgar in 2 volumes, as well as 2 Festschrift in his honor and in the honor of Marius Echereccia. Marc, please.
Right. So, well, just like Joseph, I have written a book review of the book, and it will be published this year in Egypt Intervention. So I almost read from cover to cover the whole book. I must say I skipped the chapters, or I went very quickly over the ones dealing with the historians and the sociologists. But you know, it's his book is an incredible detective story. It's also painful to read, even if I am not a Cambridge person. It's a mixture of interviews, documents that have been written by others, from the Cambridge archives as well, testimonies, interviews. So, you know, it's an incredible amount of work. Now, and it even includes responses. I mean, the draft was sent to some people, asking them to read this or that chapter, and then Ashwani got emails, and he included some of the comments of the emails in the final version of the book. I mean, Ashwani mentioned the 6 causes which have been advanced for the failure, so to speak, of Keynesian or post-Keynesian economics at Cambridge. So he mentioned insularity, irrelevance of some topics, like not everybody got interested into the Cambridge capital issues. Ideological, Jeffrey Hodgson insists on this, that it was overly ideological. There was no coherence with different people holding a very different view among the heterodox. Ashwani mentioned the natural demographics. The incubants did not care enough about the younger staff, in contrast to what the neoclassical were doing. And there was also the issue about textbooks. I mean, essentially, I would say the book is about 2 things. It's about some of the strategic mistakes that were done within Cambridge, perhaps sometimes due to personal grudges. But then the main cause was those inexorable outside forces. The fact that there was this neoliberalism wave that went through Cambridge, but also we could experience it in my own department at the University of Ottawa. Edwin Lehéron, in an email recently, mentioned that something similar happened to France, although maybe France resisted better than in other countries. And one can say that it even happened in international organizations such as the OECD. There's a couple of very interesting papers telling how, for instance, Stephen Maris, who was it's not Robin Maris, it's Stephen Maris, who was a Cambridge graduate, gradually got evinced from his position of special advisor to the general, to the Secretary General of the OECD in 1983. So it's very well told in the book that there was this combination of the monetarist got together with people in general equilibrium theory, in microeconomic, neoclassical economics, in order to get rid, purge Cambridge and England of heterodox economics. What I took from the book, if I go a bit more into the anecdotes, is that Frank Hahn is really the main villain. And then there was this group of four, Frank Hahn, Robin Matthews, who, despite everything, is considered as a Keynesian when you read some other articles or books. Partha Dasgupta, I saw him in action with Frank Hahn when they criticized Alfred Eichner, who had written a paper in Nature, and they responded in a very nasty way to Eichner. And David Newberry was the fourth. And as explained by Ashwani, getting control over various institutions allowed them to have control over the research assessment exercises in England. And I think Fred Lee article of 1998, where he said those research assessment exercises are the beginning of the end for heterodox economics. He had understood very well what was going on. Now, another thing is that, well, what about the heterodox people in Cambridge? Well, as Ashwani said, Kaldor brought in Frank Hahn first, I think it was in 1965, was it? And, well, we all know that Joan Robinson was very good at making enemies, even among people who at first sight would have been friendly with her. But the one that really does not come out well, I mean, from my reading of the book, I don't know what Maria Cristina will be thinking, is Richard Kahn. He is being, it's being said by Robin Neal that he was a kind of mafioso in running things. Frank Hahn strongly objected to Neal getting Joan Robinson's chair in 1971. He maneuvers very well to have Frank Hahn as his successor in 1972. He launched this attack against New Cambridge in 1974. He had close connections with Michael Posner, who also played a very important, nasty role in the demise of the Department of Applied Economics, and with also other adversaries of the Department of Applied Economics. He remained in very friendly terms with Harry G. Johnson, our Canadian colleague, who also was very nasty with regards to Cambridge economics. And well, he refused to take part in the creation of the Cambridge Journal of Economics. and he remained silent during the early 1980s when left Keynesianism was under attack. My former author, Win Godley, also does not look good. Well, not always, but for other reasons. He is said to be politically ineffective. He was brilliant, but he was gullible, naive, and politically ineffective, and did not seem to take care enough about the non-tenure staff. Well, I should say Win Godley is my co-author, so I'm just reproducing here what is in the book. Okay, I will finish with similar remark to Joseph Halevi, although not as pessimistic as Joseph seemed to be. It's also a concern with regards to the last chapter, where Ashwani seems to be overly optimistic, in my view, about the future of Cambridge economics in Cambridge. Well, I know there's this Judge School where there are several successful heterodox economists who are there, but I think he was overly optimistic with regards to, say, the Cambridge INET program there, and the money which comes from donators, former students at Cambridge, and the fact that INET has pulled the plug from this unit is quite understandable. I mean, I looked at some of the working papers produced by INET, and there's nothing heterodox about it. So, but on the other hand, I'm more optimistic than Joseph. There is indeed green shoots all over in England and all over the world. There's a renaissance of this heterodox post-Keynesian economics. And so I'll finish with this more optimistic tone and just ask a question, if Ashwani has the time to answer. Why did he start this huge project? Was it because as a result of the book that he had written about Ajit Singh, or was it for other reasons? Thank you.
Merci, Marc. Thank you. Yes, I was going to make a comment about Joseph's pessimism. I wrote a paper recently that's going to come out, and I can't remember which journal, called The Future of Post-Keynesian Economics. And I agree with Marc. I'm very optimistic. I think there's a lot of, you mentioned offshoots or shoots. I agree. And I think it's just relative to the objective that we give ourselves. If we compare ourselves to, you know, should we be part of big departments or publish in big journals, etc., though that's a problem, I think I understand the pessimism. We'll never get there. But it just depends on what the aim, what's our focus here. And in that sense, I think I'm a lot more pessimistic. I'm very pessimistic. I'm sorry, optimistic. Now, the next comments are by last but not least, Maria Cristina Marcuzo. She is a professor of political economy at the University of Rome, La Sapienza in Italy, and fellow of the Italian Academy of Lincei, former president of the European Society for the History of Economic and the Italian Society for the History of Political Economy. She's a distinguished fellow of the History of Economic Society. Collections of her essays have been published by Routledge, for example, Fighting Market Failure in 2012, and by Cambridge Scholars Publishing, her essays in Keynesian Persuasion in 2019. Maria Cristina.
Thank you very much. I read the book cover to cover for two reasons. One, because I spent my professional life on Cambridge economics, so I felt I had to do it. But secondly, I felt a duty to homage such a passionate and well-researched work. And so I think I owe Ashwani to read it cover to cover. Nevertheless, I was a little bit perhaps put off by too many repetitions, but as you said, the book was not meant to be read cover to cover. That's a minor sin. In my comment, I will raise a couple of points, 2 or 3 points, which I think might be worth discussing as a complement to what have been said by Ashwani Saith and by the commentator. The first is related to what Ashwani calls the heterodox tradition of Cambridge economics. And while we all agree that this is a useful term of reference to characterize the difference of the group vis-a-vis the quadrumvirate, Har, Matthew, Dasgupta, Numeri, I don't think it makes enough clear the differences existing within that tradition. I personally have argued many times, and I'm sure that Ashwani agrees with me, that although we cannot speak of a Cambridge school, since there is no unifying approach, they are very clearly distinguishable research agenda within it, one stemming from Marshall Pigou Robertson, the other Keynes Can Robinson, and partially, I will explain why partially, Kaldor, and of course Rafa, which is a bit absent in the book. Since we remember Luigi, I would like to mention his bravely attempt to find the ingredients of the Cambridge tradition. He has 9 ingredients to provide an answer to the question, what is Cambridge economics? But I don't think that even Luigi can give a full answer to that question. I would like to mention a recent book edited by Lynn Chester and Tao Zhou, Heterodox Economic Legacy and Prospects. If you want to have an injection of optimism on heterodox economics, read this book. And what they do there, they have tried to list, following Lee in a sense, what is heterodox economics? And they list interdisciplinarity, openness, relevance for understanding the real world, pluralism, social concerns, and so forth. And you know that kind of list fits many bills. So I'm not sure how Cambridge fits in that respect. And so the question is, what is heterodox means, and how heterodox was Cambridge economics in that respect? I would like to quote from another book by Carlo Di Politi, in which he has tried to measure heterodox in the profession by doing this exercise of checking the jail code, where you publish in a journal and so on. Terrifying news is that the share of identified heterodox economies worldwide was 11% in 1980s, and now we are around 8% at the end of 20. So if we take this as a measure of heterodoxy, we are entitled to be quite pessimistic, but of course this is just an exercise. Now, it is true that this is not the point of Ashwani book, to talk about the theoretical dimension of the conflicts. And I think he's very honest about it in saying, this is not what I'm about. I'm about to explain the mechanism of control over the process of production knowledge. And nevertheless, I think that the point of what is exactly the Cambridge approach to economics, and whether we are entitled to use this term, is something that remains on the table. And this is something that might be worth discussing. This is my first point. The second point is the list of internal reasons for the defeat of Cambridge heterodox tradition. I think that Marc has already summarized them, but let me just recall them. They did not put into place a viable process of intellectual and organizational reproduction. Second, they made the idiosyncratic into some minds serious problematic appointments. Third, they failed to widen the domain of heterodox influence in ways that would create other knowledge outside Cambridge, and so forth. And the fourth, they seem to lack the lateral vision of taking institutional initiatives within Cambridge to broaden the base of the Orthodox tradition. And these are very, I think, important points. I would like to add another reason, which is referring to the book, but I don't think enough stress, namely the internal theoretical divisions, not just the personal rivalries. And the case of Zrafa is a point, even if, you know, they were very good personal friends. I think that the Zrafa's tradition, the Keynes tradition, and the other tradition were not going in the same direction, okay? And so this is something that needs to be taken into consideration to explain what happens in the aftermath. I personally, and let me answer, let's say a little bit on Kant, I found particularly disconcerting Caldor's position more than Kant's. And the example of the appointment of Kant, the attack on sociology, and other examples in which Nicky seemed at one point more an LSE person than a Cambridge person. And perhaps his origin shows up not late in life, but I'm talking about the 50s and the 60s, when the rivalry with Joan was rampant, and late in life. I must say, I personally very fond of Caldor. I owe to him the invitation to Cambridge to become member of High Table of Kings. I have many reasons to be close to him. I interview him in a long interview, which is similar to one I did with Kant, but it is in Italian. And I wonder whether at one point I might be able to translate it into English. Now, I met Richard late in life, and so I met him when he was not the Mazzarino or the Richelieu of Cambridge economics any longer. And what I can say that he was always very passionate about the Keynesian tradition. I think he didn't understand very well the other side, or the other part of the Cambridge tradition, namely Zrafa. And I'm sure that what Ashwani say about his maneuvering and so on is right, but I would try to defend his intellectual integrity in defending Keynesianism, especially against monetarism. He was the man who in the House of Lords fought more tenaciously against Mrs. Thatcher. And it might have been a bit of a, schemer when it comes to the academics, but his integrity as a Keynesian, I think, cannot be disputed. And finally, let me get to my third point, which is not so much a matter of being optimistic, but to be fact-finding. So what is the Cambridge heritage? Where did it go? Theoretically, in terms of intellectual heritage, I mean. And I think in thinking about this, I think they are following these three research agendas I mentioned, Marshallian, post-Keynesian, and Zrafian. I think we can find a legacy which is thriving and is producing interesting results. The first is the industrial district kind of literature, which derive from Marshall. And this is a kind of research agenda that has been applied. I think even in India, they have interesting work done on industrial district. And the way in which you study the industrial situation, not as an individual firm. And this comes distinctively from the Marshallian tradition, Marshallian, Chauve, and all the Levinson and so forth. The other research agenda, which I think became very successful intellectually and from the point of view of research outcome, is the evolutionary vision, the organic development of firms and society, the way in which economic change can be understood by using adaptive behavior, for instance, or selection through competition. Of course, we tend to associate this with Schumpeter, but I think this comes very well. And I think my late friend Raffaelli made an important contribution in showing that it's the Marshallian tradition then was fruitful in that respect. And this is the first line of research. These 2 points from the Marshall show. Then, of course, the most important and the most recognized tradition is post-Keynesians and so forth, especially after the meltdown. It was also connected with Minsky and so forth. Point is that there are variety within the group of post-Keynesians, and these varieties in terms of emphasis and so on, and especially when it comes to the confrontation with, for instance, the tradition, the so-called neo-Ricardian of Srafas, we can see that sometimes these two traditions do not get along very well in pursuing the Cambridge agenda. And also within the Srafa tradition, the program has been carried forward along different lines. Pasinetti was one line, Garignani was one line. And this again was a matter, I mean, it's a proof of the richness of this tradition. It's a proof of the variety of this approach, but this again is another proof of the internal differences that are not very helpful when you have to conquer the mainstream, okay? And so I would like to close that there is no reason for optimism in terms of institutional setup, but there is reason for optimism for intellectual variety, richness of approaches. And while I'm not sure whether it's INET or whether other young people that who are the one who will carry the torch, but as long as there is intellectual richness, there is hope. There might not be victory, but there is reward for sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Cristina. I don't think I heard the name Koletsky in your brief comments. Oh, I've got lots of stuff to say.
No, I could talk a lot about this.
Yeah. But I will thank you to all four commentators. Ashwani, perhaps you want to say a few things, and then we'll go to questions from people. We're doing good in terms of in time. So Ashwani.
Okay, I thank you ever so much. It's an occasion for all of us to share thoughts and so on. The book is just incidental to the sharing. But thank you for the positive comments. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for the criticisms. A few questions were pointed, so I think maybe I'll just give an immediate quick answer to that. I think Joseph asked about India and Cambridge. I think in the book there is something in the development chapter on Cambridge in India, and it's followed by a section on India and Cambridge, but that's more like people and cohorts. But I think Joseph's question was perhaps more about the kinds of traditions which were going on with regard to planning and that kind of thing, and how those were maybe interacting with the goings on in Cambridge. I think this goes to the heart of the matter of the applicability of post-Keynesian analysis to a developing country situation. And that's where Alphabet Rao was saying, no, it can't work. But he was thinking of pretty much the multiplier, general theory, that sort of a framework. But I think later on, those questions have come back in the current situation where employment is a huge issue. And so there are mechanisms of having employment guarantee programs all over the country on demand. And people say, well, if you do that, it's going to be inflationary. But then there's a question that if they can also improve the supply side, maybe that balances out. That's what Joan was saying. That's what others have also said. There's that kind of a debate about going on in this regard. There is I think the Vicky Rao exchange is still now alive, but in a slightly wider context. The point that strikes me, though, is Hans Singer made this distinction between Keynes 1 and Keynes 2 in a sense. He said Keynes 1 is general theory Keynes and multiplier, talking about developing countries. And Keynes 2 is the Keynes 2 of the Bretton Woods institutions and the question of the international environment within which development happens. And he says, if the Keynesian perspective had actually taken hold, and that is what the Bretton Woods institutions were actually doing, then the environment for development would be very different and be very positive and so on and so forth. So he's saying that much earlier in the 1980s. I think that question has been overtaken by history. We have globalization on a scale where it's impossible to make a clear separation between developing countries and developed countries. It also goes back to Caldor, who was talking about demand from third world countries in terms of, in terms of trade and that type of thing. So I think that the idea of India, or for India, I try to read development literature, and I think there's a question of necessity, there's an imperative for integration. It requires a global framework within these countries. That's what's happening. And if you take it in that manner, then I think whether it's India in Cambridge or China in Cambridge or the development as it is now, literature, political economy or development in relation to post-Keynesianism, I think that's a broader perspective. I think that's a very interesting and very valid question about how those things come together. The specific names you mentioned, I think we can talk about. I know them all, knew them all very personally. I think all the names you mentioned are all gone. Ian Raj, Ashok Rudra, Khalid Naqvi, but Shokumar Chakravarti, there's so many of them. But then what I do want to mention is, for example, the work of Amit Bhaduri. If you take the work of Amit Bhaduri, Sunanda Sen, Prabhat Patnaik, Amir Bagchi, you find here that we are actually looking at very often global issues or issues of, say, even if it is of Indian economic growth, but it is within a wider framework which is applicable within a global, it requires to be seen within a global framework or international framework. That's what I meant by the integration of these issues. So I think it's a very rich question you raised, Joseph, and I think maybe follow up bilaterally. So I think that's one of the things I would say. Thank you so much. Marc, I think Francis things I entirely accept. I think what he's saying, he was absolutely bang on this. There's much I was learning from that as well. Marc's question about, I think, Marc, you had a thing, you're a bit not as optimistic. I think my comments on Vin Godley are actually quite positive. And those things about his lack of political acumen, I think applies really to the university politics. He was the exact opposite in a way in terms of his skill and capabilities there, as say Brian Redaway. He could not defend his patch. They could weave rings around him. He was, and that's what I sense. I said he's a bit naive or gullible. And if you read those stories, you find that the university authorities actually playing games with him. And he doesn't have strong cards in his hands because, at the end of the day, the financing is chopped off from outside. And so he's up against it. But I think that's the comment I was, otherwise I have a lot of time for him. And I think you'll enjoy that because, of course, you know him so well. But there's so many stories about him in this regard. The question of the last chapter, I think I was so depressed by the story I was telling that I couldn't cope with it. And I think I had to say something to myself to cheer myself up, to make, that life is worth living. I'm an eternal optimist by nature. And I thought maybe I have to look at these green shoots. But there are very careful points there, here and there, because I do not believe in donor-driven academics. I do not believe in anything being donor-driven. Where these donors come from? They come from extreme inequality. They're not accountable to anybody. They're not accountable to governments. They're not accountable to democratic mechanisms and so on, but they set the agenda. Now, if you like the agenda, you say, donor is nice. But your agenda is somebody else's agenda, you say, no. The problem is actually somebody beyond accountability, an individual is setting an agenda because they have the money to be able to influence it. And I think the other side of it, I think so in principle it is questionable. And I think beyond that, it's also very idiosyncratic. A person might change their mind. Is that what it is? And all of a sudden it's gone. Or something else happens. You go somewhere else. And the third thing, which I may just mention in general, not with specifics of the donors who were there in Cambridge, individual, like organizations, have agendas. And the agendas are complex. They're not necessarily about the... And so I think there's an issue there, which I was I was trying to say, and I said that in the donor thing, if you read between the lines and sometimes on the lines, I raised that kind of a question which is there. Now, about green shoots, I entirely accept. I think I may have given the impression that there are lots of green shoots in Cambridge, but I have a one point of defense and one point of agreement. The agreement is, I think the seeds scattered from Cambridge. And that's what I meant. There's a renaissance, or there's a lot of literature which is happening. I think Joseph was much more pessimistic on this, and I think also Cristina. But I think that what you see here is, if you see the number of journals which are there, you see the number of articles being carried and published, the number of, actually, what has happened is that if you look at the mainstream departments in universities, indeed they've been squeezed out. But perhaps what is happening is that heterodox traditions are actually reconstituting and reinventing themselves, not inside mainstream departments from which they are being kicked out and there's no space for them there, but actually in multidisciplinary space outside where political economy is very much present, of the kind which was not allowed in the other places. So I think if I have to look for some of these potentialities in the social sciences, in the applied social sciences, which was always a heterodox kind of a perspective, you will see it in a combination of development studies, in political science, and in sociology, in human geography, which has become now a critical approach to globalization and things like this. Now, the issue is that there is nothing together. The queen of the sciences, political economy, is not really occupying its central space very often. So it is a project still which is acephalous in some sense, and it really needs to come together. But if you see that, the right questions are being asked about globalization. If you look at what's happening with finance, with inequality, that's where these new questions are being asked, and of course by economists as well, who are in the heterodox tradition. So that's what I found optimistic there. But if you see Cambridge itself, then some of these things are true for Cambridge also. If you see the Department of, if you see the, say, the Center for Development Studies, if you see the Judge Institute, these are two examples I gave, where you have this kind of work going on, but it doesn't have the scale effect, which of course you have if you have a full faculty. And so the result is that you have this research, and is very good research, and the journal is going there as well, which you keep down. There are lots of seminars going on in this way. And the students are interested. There are critiques from students also about this, about the university in this regard. Those things are happening, but not on a scale which could have happened had the central core of the faculty not gone in the mainstream direction. So it's, in a way, it's like sort of Paradise Lost type of a situation where it's a counterfactual. What would have happened if that other tradition had carried on and gone in a broader framework? So the core is hollow in Cambridge, because that's where the faculty and mainstream is. And around it, both in Cambridge and outside, you find these sort of green shoots, which I want to say. Now, so I remain a little optimistic, because I think that the distance between the realities of the day and the theory, mainstream theory, are so wide that people are just being drawn away from it. So to some extent, what's happening is that mainstream economics is defining itself as a discipline which of little relevance, and is drifting away as a separate entity in regard, but the central policy issues are there in front of the desk being addressed by all these kinds of other people that we are talking about. I think there is something there. It is not yet gelled into an institutional reproduction of those traditions. So that's the kind of a perspective I would take, but it needs a lot more to really to have it. It's a topic for a major discussion. So I can only hint at the kind of thing which are there in my mind. Lastly, I think, Cristina, thank you so much. I entirely take your point on Caldor and Khan. I think some of the impression I get, I think Francis here, he would know so much better. The impression one has from the outside is that some of these people were, in a way, so much above. They were sort of levitating to some extent in this sense. They felt that they were in a space where they could say, they had complete freedom to be able to say and do what they felt like. And I think, for example, Caldor's remarks, which are made in relation to sociology and in relation to some modeling as well, when he writes his personal letter, or his one-to-one letter to Lord Rothschild in the inquiry on sociology, I think is very revealing. Is very revealing, and it is quite negative actually. It's though the sociologists, all they want to do is measure how often did you have a bath and things like this. It's very dismissive, very dismissive. But at the same time, other people, including Joan, including Brown Delavay and others, are not in that way inclined. So I don't want to get personal about it, but I think there's a group. I've defended the Cambridge thing there by saying they were multidisciplinary in their orientation. If you see Brown Delavay's objections to regressions, for example, or his objections to that sort of methodology in econometrics, it goes into the matter of saying you can't really do that. You can't collapse. You can't have reductionism of a certain kind and pretend that you're talking about the real world and real processes. And so sociology and the other disciplines really flood in a way. I think that was a loss. Multidisciplinarity lost out. Will it reconstitute? Maybe. Cambridge traditions, you're so right, Cristina. I entirely, mea culpa, that would have been another book. And I don't think I'm able to write that book. That is a book for you to write and for others to write, and I'll be a consumer there. But that's why I said right from word go in the book, I am not dealing with that. And of course, the theoretical differences are very much there. All I will say is, when it came to the mainstream, they were all together. And the few times there were chips in that, they were damaging for the tradition, because actually, and sometimes they came from good things, you know. Caldor wants kneeled, and then Kahn says, no, I don't like this sort of thing. So that opens the door for, this is a story from Newbery, but it's also, I think, approximately true. But Caldor, Kahn, in some ways, and so Keynes, there's so many different traditions. If you remember, if you see the chapter on seminars, you have, of course, the King's, the Secret Seminar and all the rest of it of Kahn. But much more interesting and important, I think, is Robin Matthews' seminar at the Clare Group. Now, the Clare Group, in my view, is largely speaking an SDP orientation, you know, putative or otherwise, and moderate Keynesians, some probably not Keynesian, not labor types at all, or SDP types at all. And I think they will play a very powerful role in what really happens. So when you look at the divisions inside Cambridge as well, there are a lot of divisions within the Keynes group as well, and not just new economics and you know, the Kahn type and the Caldor, the Neil type. So yes, indeed, you're absolutely right. And I think those played to some extent into the loss of power. But I don't think that the theoretical positions between, say, the Sraffians and, say, the post-Keynesians, for example, although they would fight in seminars and very often not be, as you said, personally be very happy with each other. But when it came to taking a stand on mainstream economics in the faculty board on the elections, they would actually, on the whole, come together. With reluctant ear sometimes, but they would come together. I think that's what I would say on that. But thank you so much. I think I will reserve my right to remain optimistic, regardless of what the percentage is and what the things happening. But without optimism, I think I'm going nowhere. So what is it? Pessimism of the intellect and Joseph, optimism of the will. I think I will hide behind that.
As Keynes tells us, we are subject to bursts of optimism and pessimism, so appropriately. Okay, so thank you very much to everyone who participated. Now, if there are questions from those attending, please just raise your hand. You do so by clicking on that little icon at the bottom of your screen. And we have, of course, I'm not surprised, Eric has the first question. Eric, please.
Thank you very much. I'm asking this question as an applied economist. In the story that I heard, it was a combination of an academic story and it seemed to me a policy story that was a bit behind the scenes. So that Frank Kahn was really down on applied economics, but clearly was willing to offer advice on the basis of ungrounded models. And Francis mentioned that that was a demand on the side of policymakers for something very unambiguous, straightforward, and that there was a distinction perhaps between that demand in the UK and Europe, and I would say also in the US, and in developing countries where I have found, and it sounds like Francis has found, an acceptance of ambiguity and maybe a demand for more nuanced analysis. And I guess my question is, how much was the changing policy environment, the demand for something unambiguous, by policymakers enabling that shift, even if it was driven by people within the department. You're muted.
I think we have the perfect person to answer that question, and that's Francis.
Francis, do you want to say a few words? And unmute yourself, please.
I think at the time, policy issues were very hot in the UK and in much of the developing world as well, for that matter. In fact, worldwide. And they were maybe even hotter than the issues within the faculty and the Department of Applied Economics between fellow economists. I mean, the 1970s was a time of extraordinary stress as the world economy violently changed its shape with enormous impact on many countries all over the world and taking us from one disaster to another, which perhaps people have by now forgotten. I mean, there was a kind of warm-up in the 60s in the UK with rising stagflation, they called it. But the Arab-Israel War in 1973 really disrupted the entire world economy quite strongly and led to a complete collapse of the stock market in Britain and a kind of traumatic introduction of a Labour government trying to get through with trade union support and a financial situation which was more or less unmanageable because the Arab beneficiaries of the oil price increase were moving their money out of Britain. And think one thing led to another. And then there was the disastrous 1980s. I mean, first there was what we used to call atomic war monetarism in the United States, because the price of oil in the second war between the Iran-Iraq war led to a quite serious inflation in the United States, where monetarism had taken hold, and the Fed tried to defeat monetarism by raising interest rates to an incredible level, which today is unimaginable, but led to the collapse of large parts of South America and other developing countries that have borrowed heavily and were unable to meet the new financial conditions, and so on. I mean, the world staggered from one crisis to another, really, through that period where globalization was taking root progressively, quite quietly in a way. Maybe people weren't giving it that much attention because their minds were on the crises that kept happening. So I think all that context somehow created a situation in which the fallback was textbook economics of the worst variety, the very simple nostrums that would give us something to hold on to in how to handle one crisis after another. I mean, hopefully, because of the multipolarity of the world today, a bit more space for rational discussion of international issues than there was in the worst times in the past. But there's a very long way to go because we sort of feel we're edging into a new Cold War, which bodes very badly for positive international discussion and understanding of each other's problems. So I do think the political context is rather critical. I used to think that economics is a kind of religion. It's a modern religion which justifies the use of political power around the world. It's a way to explain to the people why we do the things, why governments do the things they do. And to that extent, it's inevitably disreputable and somewhat dishonest. And become very scholastic as well. So it sort of repeats the role of religion in centuries ago, before empiricism got hold. And somehow empiricism hasn't succeeded in coming back and taking over again. So we are victims of endless misunderstanding and sort of folklore, which works for one country and not for another. And I don't see how the world's going to get out of that in time. I think a lot of things will go wrong. It would take decades to get out of this mess. And meantime, we better prepare for some bad times. That's what I would advise young people today.
Thank you, Francis. Is there another question from people attending, from the audience? Now, Ed Nell was registered, but I guess he's not here. I would have liked to hear some of his comments. Anyone else?
There is a question in the chat, I think.
Okay, and Pedro, I'll go to Pedro first. Pedro, if you can unmute yourself and perhaps turn your camera on, and then I'll turn to the chat.
So perhaps I have a more simple question, but I would like to ask Professor Ashwani if how does he evaluate the fact that by creating this department specifically for development economics or political economy, we're sort of depriving because they deal with the most fundamental questions of economics, and we are sort of depriving the economic department of their more fundamental questions and making it be more dominated by more neoclassical economists. How does he evaluate this situation? Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. Well, that was not my recommendation. That's not what I would like to see happen. That's the reality that I was describing, in the sense that it's the causation goes the other way and the timeline is the other way. I think the potentialities, development, if you think talking about Cambridge, sociology, economic history, development, they were all part of the Faculty of Economics and Politics, as it used to be called. And at a certain date in the early 2000s, they took away the word "and politics." Yeah, it just wanted to be pure economics. But over that process, they were also taking away from there all the impurities. They were Sanskritizing, to use a sociological term, to purify yourself. And that purification required the expulsion of all impurities, and other disciplines were impurities. And so you find slowly, first of all, the expulsion of sociology. And I think the term there used was these are colleagues from vaguely cognate disciplines, which means that you do, what are you doing? Who are you? Go away. And Robin Matthews said that we should give them a bride price, a dowry, which is, we give them a bit of money and they go away to a new department. So they were trying to expel them because they were not really connecting with the kind of economics they wanted to do. And I think so and the same thing happened slowly to economic history. Economic history started off in earnest in the Department of Applied Economics through the statistical needs of the big project that understood on the original DAE of the Cambridge Growth Project came a bit later. But the whole idea was you have, of course, the development of inferential methods and on the econometric side of things, but also there wasn't a database, a systematic database, long-term trend series and so on, to analyze the process of the growth and structural change in the UK. So the idea was also to have all kinds of statistical databases assembled. So that became the Economic History Project, which was remarkably productive. And so that project now, as the interest with regard to the creation of databases went down, because the databases to some extent were there, you found that slowly the interest also with regard to maintaining economic historians inside the DAE also went down. So some of the economic historians went over to the faculty side, and some of them just left, and those projects actually died away. So all the old timers, whether it's Max Cole or whether it is Brian Mitchell or it is to do with Charles Feinstein or Phyllis Dean, they all sort of slowly went off from this, and they went towards the faculty or away altogether. So that's the economic history side. Sociology went into its own department, and they were actually, to tell you the truth, I think some of them, once they saw the writing on the wall, they didn't want to be part of a mainstream economics department run by the mainstreamers. So they also said, we have our own department. And when Tony Giddens joined the faculty, he was a powerful innovator, and he could create the situation for them to be able to leave and have their own department. So they also left. Development did not want to leave, but it was eased out. Development was asking all the wrong kind of questions. You know, they were about talking about radical Marxist type, or, you know, it's Hao-Yun Chang, or it is Gabriel Palmer, or Ajit Singh. You know, they're asking all different kind of questions, you see. So they didn't much like that, because, and this was actually Keynes in his international framework. Keynes, Caldor were the two guiding lines, spirits for this type of work. They were also eased out. So they went and they joined different departments here and there, but after a while, there's a Center for Development Studies where they have gone. Now, and some of them went to the Judge Institute. So these are processes of expulsion. These are not, so I agree with you. I think the students in economics at this time are deprived of discussions, of the open-mindedness, and of the challenges and the questions which come from all these different disciplines and these different experiences which those disciplines are analyzing. So they're deprived of it. And, you know, to tell you just now, I think you know that what started, I think Marc has also written, I've used that in the book, because what started in Paris as a complaint against economics and the mono view of economics a long time back. And that led to new journals online, and then the journals starting off, you know, the Review of World Economy and so on. But if you look at, then Cambridge followed. The Cambridge students also objected. We don't want this kind of a monodisciplinary approach. And in Cambridge now, there's a Cambridge Society for Economic Pluralism, where the students are committed to wanting pluralism, but the faculty is something else. So I entirely agree with you, but this is not something that I recommend or something that I am justifying. I think this is the way it happened. Yeah, it came from the push from the mainstream side to push these people out. But now all these sides, other sides are very dynamic. And the question you ask about economics, why you're depriving economics, the kind of political economy which connects all these different sides, but eventually the questions all come down to economy. Is it economics in some way? Political economy, you can't do without it in the center in some form. So they come there, but it's a very different kind of political economy from the one which is being practiced at this time in the mainstream economics department, because they are being professional economic mainstreamers. And so there's not much give and take in between that. The donors are trying to shift the economics faculty into this type of other direction in some way, whether it is, you know, through different kind of institutes or this fund or that fund. I don't know. I wouldn't like to take a strong view on whether it is succeeding or not, but I have my own questions about the limits to which it can go. After all, Robert Matthews said the trouble with purifying the department, Han also, when it comes to the research and assessment exercises, is that people have tenure. You know, these heterodox economists in the faculty have tenure. What do you do with them? So then you have to reorganize them, locate them somewhere else, do something else, and so on. The same thing applies to the mainstreamers in the sense that they also have tenure. So who's going to say, you know, we shift things? So shifting is only at the margin. And that marginal shift does not change the character of the faculty. It becomes some kind of a advertisement point that, look, we are very open-minded, we are doing this and that and so on. But the separation between the interdisciplinarity, asking the questions moving from reality, taking a Kaleskian sort of approach and viewing from there, and the mainstreamers which work on theory and want the world in some way or the other to conform, that division remains very strong. Okay.
Thank you, Ashwani. I have a quick question from the chat from Terry Baker. It says Frank Hahn was broken and disillusioned at the end. He never understood money, but money was at the heart of Keynes and Keynesian economics in Cambridge. Why did the applied economists in Cambridge not attack his flawed view of money?
Yes. Can I expand on my question?
Oh, yes, please. Thank you.
First of all, it's lovely to see so many friends here and colleagues in real time. And I want to say about Ashwani's book, it is monumental. And, well, it's amazing, perceptive, rigorous research and enormous effort. And I greatly admire it. Neoclassical economics is pseudoscience. It's a deranged, degenerate project. That's what Imre Lakatos says. And he was a great philosopher of science. I'll say it again. Pseudoscience. It's not science. I keep saying it's rubbish. It's angels dancing on the head of the pin. Look at their location economics. Beijing, in location theory, is represented as a single point in space. Utterly, utterly ridiculous. Representative agents. What nonsense. Alan Kerman, a great economist, a mathematical one, he said about representative agents what rubbish it was. What nonsense. What about diversity? Everybody's different. It's so obvious. We'd all be dead if we were all the same. What can one say? And of course, I'm angry. All that time, all those efforts. And Frank Hahn, let's come back to my point. I knew Frank Hahn. I was there when he was in his wheelchair at the end, utterly disillusioned, didn't know what he was doing, you know, ill in a wheelchair. What can one say? He looked at me and he said, well, it was miserable. He just couldn't understand money. Well, 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 economists that can't understand money. What can one say? Money is the basis of economics. Money is the center. Keynes knew that. We all know that. But where is monetary economics? In the Department of Applied Economics. It wasn't anywhere. We assumed, what would you assume? We made the same assumptions that the neoclassicals made. We did. We assumed that it was, what, an illusion? It just somehow disappeared. The veil of money? What nonsense. There's no veil of money. Utter rubbish. So what do? Well, we've got this, what I would say was a nail to the head of the snake, i.e. neoclassical economics, from Ashwani. And I would say, thank you. You've done a service to the profession. What do you say to the people who are lost in this world of pseudoscience, who get publications, who, like Nordhaus, get a Nobel Prize for utter, I call it wicked. Do you know how many people are likely to die because of the prognosis, the forecasts that come out of Nordhaus's work with his Nobel Prize? I'm sorry, I get very emotional about this. And we should. We should. We're talking about mankind, extinction. Well, as you can imagine, I'm in a terrible state. But I suspect we all should be. Because this ideology has overtaken the whole world. Money, 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 all the adverts, sex is turned into money, power is turned into money. It's all money, 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 money. And surely economics should have money at its very heart. It's money that drives the system. It's money that circulates, money that we accumulate. Money, money, money. Money is shit. My grandchildren tell me. Money's shit. They want to have a good time. They want to go to a mosh pit, if you know what that is. They want to throw themselves around. So what's real? What's money? That's my question. What's real and what's money?
Thank you. Thank you, Terry. I just want to say, regarding money and finance, thank God we gave the Nobel Prize to Ben Bernanke this year. According to him, no one took finance seriously until he came around. So, you know,
Yes.
thank you for that. Ashwani, you have comments?
I think, as I said earlier, I think we have the perfect person to answer the question on money and economics, and he's there. He is, Marc.
I know Marc, he's been at one of our workshops.
So there you go, and it's much better listening to Marc than listening to me on this, I can assure you.
Well, the only thing I will say is the remark I put on the chat, which is that Frank Hahn, when he was asked around, I think, 1989, in a book edited by Fewell, what he thought about the work of Joan Robinson, answered that the best work by Joan Robinson was on monetary economics. So that's all I will say.
I hope he understood money if he said that. Okay, well, unfortunately, we have to say to come to an end. I want to thank Ashwani for his time, the commentators, for those attended, for those who asked questions. Thank you very much, everyone, for this. The video, I'll try to edit it tomorrow and put it on YouTube, and I'll send the link around so you can see
Can I
it.
say something quickly?
Yeah, please,
I
Matt.
think everybody has to be very thankful for your energy, the usual
Yeah.
ability to have things happening, even when
Yeah.
they are difficult and they require many people around. I think we all very grateful for the work you've done for our community. And I'm sure that that's what Luigi would tell you if he were here.
Yeah, at some point there were 100 participants.
Yeah,
And
yeah. Well,
Luigi would say that, would say thank you as well.
thank you, Maria. It was very kind of you. I do it because I get inspiration from the people around me. People inspire me, and that's why I do it. And I want to thank, people inspiring me like Marc and Mario and yourself, Maria, and so many others. And I'm reading a lot about Alfred Eichner right now, and he just inspires me very much. Someone that we've forgotten a little bit. We should bring him back and make sure that everyone knows about his contribution to building a heterodoxy in the school and the institution. Well, thank you very much. And thank you. Thank you, everyone. And Happy New Year. And let's hope we don't lose anyone for a couple of months. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye, Ashwani. Bye,
Thank you,
Ashwani.
bye.
See you.